Good afternoon, Lynette Oxley here for TacShack Tactical TV. Today I'm here with Gerard Labuschagne, the author of this book. It's an awesome read. I really enjoyed it. I know Gerard for quite some time, but we've only seen each other on the range, so this is something totally different. Gerard, tell me a little bit about yourself, because you've got a very interesting history.
Sure. I mean, how far back do you want me to go? I'm born to two parents.
I'm very glad to hear that.
Very fortunate.
No aliens?
No aliens. And they're still married. And so I grew up in a nice, stable home. I don't have a, when you read about stories or fictional stories about profilers, they always seem to have these horrible, twisted histories themselves, or went through, I was very privileged. I'm open to say it. Good, stable home. My father was a diplomat, so we did move around throughout the world quite a bit. Basically pretty much grew up in Irene and Pretoria for when we were actually in South Africa. Went to Pretoria Boys High, so Oscar Pistorius' school.
Okay.
A good couple of years before him, of course.
And you were at his trial as well. You were involved in his trial.
Quite involved in his trial on behalf of the state. And like people of the day, finished school, didn't know what I wanted to do. I ended up doing national service. I think we were amongst the last sort of 1 or 2 years of people who were kind of, if you didn't go, you were, prosecuted. I mean, after sort of 18, 90, etc.
What do they call them? They call them, there was a subscription. It was anti-subscription.
Anti-conscription. So I went. I mean, I was nothing fancy. I was a medic in the intensive care unit at One Mall for basically the whole of my national service. Good for me in the sense it made me grow up. I was 17 when I got to the army. I grew up very quickly, and it also gave me a direction in my life. I always said that if I'd gone to study something straight after school, I would have dropped out probably. I didn't know what I wanted to do. At the end of the army, I started, going for career guidance, counseling tests, and eventually kind of settled on the idea of psychology and public relations. I have no idea why. I am not really, besides in my work context, I'm not a social person.
Yeah.
But I ended up getting into Tukkies really by fluke. They were doing an experiment to see people who didn't have the proper good marks. I don't even think I had university entrance. That's how horrible my metric marks were. But would aptitude tests be a better predictor of people's future success than merely looking at their marks? And that's how I actually got into university. So literally by an experiment, a psychological experiment got me into psychology at university. And 91 started at Tukkies. Couldn't speak any Afrikaans. I mean, I went to an English school. I'd lived most of my earlier years overseas. My Afrikaans was non-existent. Very quickly learned how to speak Afrikaans, because in those days Tukkies was pretty much very just Afrikaans.
Yeah, I went to Rand Afrikaans Universiteit, so yes. Although we had quite a lot of English-speaking students when I was there. So.
And I was grateful for that, because I mean later on I could do therapy, and eventually when I qualified as a psychologist, I could do therapy in Afrikaans. So it kind of opened up two different angles for me to apply my psychology. And later on, when I had to testify, when I was in the police in the Northern Cape, it's Afrikaans.
I just wanted to say there's quite, I'm sure, a large component of the people that you had to interview was also going to be in Afrikaans.
So I was grateful. I think it's good to learn any language. I did Zulu for a year at university, and sadly didn't stick with it after my first year. I swapped it out for sociology. But anyway, I got went further and further. My psychology was very fortunate. I started to enjoy what I was doing, so of course my marks improved. Which is normal, natural.
It's normal. I enjoyed university much more than I enjoyed school as well. So, and I also don't think that book cleverness is necessarily clever. I've met a lot of people that's got like standard 3s that's very clever people.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, as you see later in the book, I mean, I say some of the smartest people I met were the detectives that I was working with, and how that problem-solving skill from you have a dead body, you don't know who it is, you're not yet quite sure how they died, and no witnesses, and you end up solving a case and getting someone convicted beyond a reasonable doubt as the standard of proof.
You have to have a certain type of way of thinking about stuff, etc.
So that, I mean, so I agree with you 100% that, having lots of degrees. I know stupid people that have PhDs, like really stupid people.
I agree 100%.
I don't know how they get through life, they're that stupid, but they have a PhD. It's hard work, that's really all it is. So eventually went further and further. I enjoyed what I was doing, like you said, that just makes you do better and want to do better. And was very lucky enough to eventually get selected to do my clinical psychology training for my master's. And never thought I was going to end up doing the kind of work that I've written about in the book. I thought I was going to work at a place like Sterkfontein or Weskoppies, maybe for a couple of years, go work at the university, have a bit of a part-time practice, hear bored housewives complaining about their problems, and be a normal psychologist. And then I suppose, again, higher powers or karma my path took eventually a different
way.
path. So I worked at Weskoppies for about 3.5 years. That was, always have to say I worked there. I was not forcefully
We'll talk a
there.
little bit about Weskoppies later on as well. So, so at the beginning of the book, you said that this was a personal journey that I could, that only I could put into words. Why do you say that? Because I'm sure a lot of people approached you that wanted to write the story because it's an interesting subject matter. It's something that people are very interested in.
You know, and the previous head of the investigative psychology unit, Micki Pistorius, had written a number of books. The first one was also, her experiences, and then she wrote a few others. And those were very, very popular. And people, so literally the day I started, people said, so when you're writing yours? And I thought, well, at that point I had nothing to write about. And as time went by, I think it was a case of, we were just too ridiculously busy to now even consider tackling a book. I knew I wanted to write an honest account, and I don't think the police would have been happy with that and happy with me, and that's not good when you're in their employment. And when I left, again, there was a lot of interest by journalists saying, can we help you write the book? Which is great, because then you have someone who knows how to write, you can put it together. But I felt, this is really, it's my story. I don't really feel anybody else could word it the way I would like to word it. So that's why...
Sorry about that, wind.
So that's why I felt, the title's Profile of Diaries, because although it's not in a day-to-day diary, it's my personal journey through these events. And I don't feel that someone else could, as I said, put that into the kinds of words. I'd have to literally re-edit it until, anyway, it's my words. So that was the kind of...
Yes, it was written in quite a humorous way in the beginning. And, that it was a very good read. Let's put it that way.
Thanks very much.
So let's go. You made another statement. You say you can visit the depths of hell. You just don't hang around there long enough. What long-term influences does the type of work you have done on a personal level? You can't not be influenced by evil, because you basically worked with some very, very evil people.
Yeah,
There's no other way to put it.
I think, when you're in it, you don't really realize the extent to which it's affecting you. I think when I left, it took 6 months, and I could kind of see how I was decompressing. And I also didn't want anything to do with the police. Even my good friends who were in the unit with me, who were my friends, I didn't want to see them for like the first 6 months. So I think you end up with such a high level of stress because of primarily the workload. I never really had nightmares and feared for my life unless we were out doing something operational, So it wasn't like I had the sort of PTSD, I don't think, in the classic sense of what we think about PTSD. But you're just on a permanent level of anxiety, but that becomes your norm, so you don't notice it after a while. But then you snap and have a fit because you can't find a pen when you want it.
I've had that description for people that's been in war zones. I've had that exact description. They say it's when you do an ordinary thing like walking in the shopping centre and something small happens that it sets you off. And
my ex-wife used to say to me, I don't understand, the world can be collapsing around you and you'll be the coolest, calmest person in the room and you'll know exactly what to do, but you can't find a pen or something that you're looking for and you start swearing and slamming cupboards, etc., etc. So I think it does. My colleagues who are still there, like Elmarie Mayberg and Jan de Lange, who've been there the longest out of anybody in the unit after me, or after I'd left. And I think, I sometimes wonder how do they cope. I think what helped was that we were a very tight-knit unit. We were really friends.
It was quite evident from when I read the book that you were quite close.
So we would talk about things, and we'd often work on cases together. So in that, and it was great to go around the country with these people because it was fun. I never felt like I needed to take leave. Because we were going to Cape Town with a buddy, Jan or Elmarie or Joyce or Andrew, whoever it was that was with me, and that was sort of fun. And you'd meet up with cops down there that you knew, and cops are a great bunch when you get to know them and they like you. So it was always great fun, and that really was, I think, very supportive. And also, as I often say, because we were focusing on having a positive outcome, which is solving the case, finding the suspect, getting them convicted, justice for the family, justice for the victim. It's not like I'm just looking at these images and I walk away and I just have this image in my head. And that's why I always say, and I think I said in the book, that like your crime scene guys and men and women who go there literally through the lens of a camera, zoom in, take these horrible pictures, they might never, ever, ever know if the case gets solved because they're not necessarily going to testify in court. They'll prepare their photograph albums, send off the exhibits to wherever they get to be, but they're not required very often to testify in court. So they don't know if that horrible thing they saw, there was closure.
There's an end, yeah. By the way, if anybody wants any questions, please just put it into the comment section and we'll try and answer it if it's sensible questions. I suppose when you deal with aftermaths of the rapist, I think, what was that, was it the Quarry?
The Muldersdrift serial rapist and the Quarry serial murder, yeah.
You talk to some of the victims afterwards and their families, and I think that must also, you also said you can't allow yourself to get pulled in by it. You have to concentrate at the job at hand. So yeah,
it's keeping that professional distance, which is difficult when obviously it's a child murder case or a child rape case or any sexual offences case is difficult when you meet that victim. And like fortunately for us, we often, if we had to interview the victims, it's weeks or months after the incident. Unlike that poor first sexual offences detective who's meeting them on the day and has to take this raw emotion and take the statements, take them to the hospital, etc. I think that would be very, very difficult. So we kind of had that luxury that we see them a bit afterwards. But of course, the big challenge often to convince these people that you're interested and you're going to help their case. So we'd have, for example, a bunch of DNA hits on a rape series. We'd go pull the dockets from the stations, and bugger all had been done in a lot of these cases. And the victim had never heard it from the police since the day they opened up their case.
That's really sad for me.
And you've got to go back there and convince them that you are going to be different. You're going to get the guy, and because if you don't have that witness testify at the trial, it doesn't matter if you've arrested him and linked him with DNA. If you don't have a witness there to say, this guy raped me, you cannot prosecute him. It's as simple as that. DNA isn't proof of rape. It's proof of whose semen it is.
Absolutely.
So if you don't have that victim, he can say, but that was consensual. So you need that evidence of the victim. So they are so crucial, and I often think we forget it's not my case as a policeman. It's actually the victim's case.
Yes, it is. It was very interesting. Like one of the serial rapists kept saying that, oh no, he was actually a male prostitute. that was an interesting turn of events in the book, which was interesting.
That's the Muldersdrift serial rapist, and he also had a dumb lawyer. I mean, he just did not have the brightest lawyer.
I sounded like it.
And he later on, he said it was his lawyer who came up with that idea, which of course is unethical for the lawyer to suggest a defense. I was trying to convince the court that of these, however many victims it was, I think 10 or 12, who didn't know each other, had no history over a number of years. They were all my clients that approached me, that we had sex in the felt, and then suddenly just open up rape cases. You're not going to win that.
No, you won't. Tell me, how many cases in total did you do approximately?
Sure, I know serial murder series. In other words, you have to have 2 or more murders for it to be a serial. I stopped counting at about 110 of murder series, 300 rape series that I stopped counting, and of course there are countless just once-off interesting odd murders, child pornography cases, child molestation cases. So individual dockets that was probably 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 easily. If you take it up, that series can have up to 20, 30 victims sometimes. So.
Sure, that's crazy. That is really something. Another interesting snippet which was just caught my sense of humour was that one of your old cell phones were given to somebody else took the cell phone over, and she started getting all of these calls because I suppose some of the guys that you dealt with had your number.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the police, I had a state cell phone, and I had that number probably almost the whole 14 years. I had the same number. So I had everything from all the cops that I'd worked with on any case you saved that. Now, I had literally thousands of numbers on my phone. And of course, as cops are cops, you'd often get the 2 a.m. drunk cop phone call, hey, Doc, how are you doing? Missing you. Versus, obviously general requests for assistance from prosecutors, etc. And there were a few, I think the Norwood serial murderer, Quibus Keldenhuis, had my phone number. And
what is it with Norwood? I'm sorry, they're in the news again.
They are, yeah.
So
with
what
the
is
firearms?
it exactly with the firearms story? It's always Norwood.
Yeah. So a few very interesting people had my phone, and for some reason when I left, they didn't give it to the acting head, or they didn't reassign it to someone else in the unit that the number could be used. And if numbers are inactive, they get recycled back into the general population of service. And obviously, poor some lady got my old number and had to literally, a lot of interesting phone calls from people.
I'm sure she did. You said you talked about Voorttrek and where you basically had your national service. You actually said, I vowed never to return, and you did. So yes. Why did you say that?
At the end of national service, look, as I said, it was good for me. It made me grow up. I think I did something helpful and meaningful in the intensive care unit. But I mean, if you'd asked me, do I want to go, at the end of matric, I would have said, no, thank you. I'm not exactly my scene. So I kind of felt at the end of it, I've done with it. I don't want to go back. I'm not looking forward to doing camps. I want to move on. And then, of course, later on when I did my master's in psychology, you have to do your internship at a particular institution.
Yeah.
And for the University of Pretoria, it was either Weskoppies or one military hospital. And I ended up going back as an intern psychologist to one military hospital.
But you said they were quite forward-thinking psychologists, not the old Freudian, is that the right terminology? You mentioned system theory paradigm.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Why were they so different from your normal psychologists there?
Yeah, I think Weskoppies has been around for many years, and a lot of people who, for example, when I went to work at Weskoppies, the guy who's the professor in charge of the psychology department had been there, I think, for 40 years. So it was a very kind of old way of looking, and the people that went there, they kind of groomed into that style. And for me, I don't like to just look at the individual, and I can't say whether you had penis envy at the age of 5. I just don't know how you can say or prove that, and I can't go fix that. So the way that one of the philosophies that I was exposed to as I got my further training was rather looking at the person in the context. The person in the context of their family, the person in the context of their business, their life, their work, employment life, and how that they play off each other and influence each other. So that was just a better way of looking at it, because I don't know what really causes someone. This theory will tell you it's that. Jung will tell you it's that. That theory tells you the cause is that. Where system theory says we don't know what the cause is. But let's look what's happening now with that problem and how it impacts upon others
so
and reverse.
In a paradigm.
Yeah.
I understand.
And ironically, the military was... But the military, I think the South African Defence Force was actually quite far ahead in how it used its psychologists compared to a lot of other militaries, very much focusing on the debriefing side of it. So actually, in a way, the perhaps just more modern in their psychological thinking.
And it was also one of the, I think we were involved in an active war for a long time.
Yeah.
So obviously certain systems had to be good at that stage. It's not just...
And a lot of money thrown into the military in those days.
Which is still done in the States and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Military is still, that's where a lot of development work takes place, because money gets thrown at problems.
Yeah, for sure.
In any case, Irma Labuschagne, so it's not your aunt, and one of the accused didn't want to speak to you because your surname was Labuschagne.
Yeah, so obviously Irma Labuschagne was a very, very well-known criminologist in South Africa, passed away, it's probably at least 10 years now. A lovely Tannie. Everybody used to call her Tannie Irma.
Yeah. And why did you testify against her? Because that was in a little sub-note at the end, which was interesting.
So as I had a lovely lady, in the times I interacted with her, she was just a very nice person. Everybody liked her. But I really didn't agree with a lot of the things she often said when she gave evidence in court, specifically called by the defense to give evidence in certain cases. And I thought, I really want to be able to jump into the witness stand and give my own opinion, which might be different to hers. But if one person is a criminologist and one person is a psychologist, the easiest way to negate the criticism is to say, well, you're not one of us. So how can you, a psychologist, criticize a criminologist, and vice versa? And I think there is merit to that. So that kind of, in a way, motivated me to go on and do another master's degree. So I could say, I am a criminologist, and I disagree with you.
Okay.
So I think she was a lovely, kind old lady. But I think in forensics, you really got to be not kind to some degree, really doubting everything and wanting additional proof. So you have to be a bit of a skeptical bastard when you do forensic work.
But I think that's just about science. You have to question everything. You can't believe anything that you see, because that's not going to work. My mom always say, you worked at Weskoppies. It was my mom always said to me as a child, if you're so naughty, you're gonna make me go crazy, and I'm gonna land up in Weskoppies. So obviously it was not a very nice place. Otherwise, she wouldn't have said that to me. So can you speak a bit about your time at Weskoppies? And there's a lot of state patients there, or is it only state patients, or is there private patients?
So it is. I think it's the largest government psychiatric hospital in South Africa, and possibly in the world. It's one of the biggest, because at that point it had 1,200 beds for patients. Sure. I think they loaded to about 1,000. I don't know what it currently is. So it's potentially one of the biggest in the world. It was built. The original buildings were modelled from a hospital, I think, in Scotland, and are over 100 years old. So in the old Boer War, it was being used.
Pretty buildings, but totally dilapidated.
Dilapidated, and of course then they built new buildings. It is a massive property. It's in the east of Pretoria, right next to the police training college. So we'd have our ward rounds, and you'd hear gunshots from the shooting range. I thought it was a great way to test if someone's faking PTSD or not, because you just hear this volley of shots as obviously the students of the college are practicing their shooting, and if the person doesn't fall to the floor, then it's probably might not be PTSD. So a great place, a great learning institution, because one remembers that that's staffed by the professors in the psychiatry department and the psychology lecturers who then would have a dual appointment. So again, it's a case of really great people working there, but the hospital dilapidated, as you say. The food's not great. Specifically, obviously, I think post 94, I think a lot of government hospitals sort of funding was cut, etc. So a lot of potential. I wouldn't want to end up there just purely because it's a bit dilapidated. But I think the quality of care in terms of the doctors diagnosing you and the medication, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But a fantastic learning environment. I think it's like people who do medicine in South Africa. You get exposed to stuff that people in the UK, USA will probably never see or even get the ability to work directly with, where our health professions do.
It's like I had quite a couple of friends that became doctors, and they said in Baragwanath, you get knife wounds and shot victims that's been shot often and a lot, and it's not something that you get overseas easily. It's not something that happens on the scale that it happens.
I mean, I remember listening to a forensic pathologist who's a friend of mine, and she said she was attending a workshop overseas on gunshot wounds. Yeah. And she said to the guy, how many gunshots, this is in the UK I think, how many gunshots autopsies have you done to this British doctor presenting the course? And he said, about 20. I mean, she does like 20 in like a month, maybe 2 months.
Absolutely. One of my best friends that went to varsity with me, her husband was a gynecologist at Barra. So, and sometimes they were like delivering babies in the hallways and stuff like that. The question, Hannes? No. Okay. Thank you. And so it was very, very interesting. Okay, you left the SAPS after 14.5 years, 14 and a half years, and you said, I felt like I've done it all.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Yes, the murder series became very carbon copy of the other ones. So then you start to try and get involved in little ones that are a bit more unique. And I found myself more and more trying to find something that's challenging. So other times, because I also had an appointment, a part-time or honorary appointment at WITS, I would sort of channel my happiness into working with the students a bit more. And I think eventually I just realized that there's the amount of happiness on what I was doing wasn't there. I think the bigger issue is as the unit expanded from, when I started, it was a colonel, myself as the head of the unit. And then we had a massive expansion 2012, 13. And they upgraded the status of the unit to a section, which was headed by a brigadier, and then opened up sort of sub-branches throughout some of the provinces. But now I became more and more of a manager, and I love managing people who are keen to work, because then it's not even management, in my opinion, helping people, guide them on the right way. But as soon as you expand and you have people who apply to join, not because they're passionate about being there. You
actually talked about it a bit in the book, about the people they were book people that had the degrees, but they didn't have the practicalities and a lot of people, the passion.
And a lot of people who apply for a post, let's say they have a detective background, because we had detectives and psychologists in the investigative psychology section. So a lot of them who when we advertised the post had never even heard of us before, but because it's a promotion post, they applied for that and 10 others, and whoever gets calls them for an interview, and they go and they're successful. So it wasn't people like before where we didn't have posts, so you had to like wangle a transfer into us on the same level, so you weren't getting the financial benefit. And as soon as I say you start advertising, unfortunately, you'll get people who are not there because they are passionate. I mean, some of the people who've been in the unit, like Elmarie, have been there since 1994 or 5.
So she's part of the furniture.
And she'll probably retire there because that's where she wants to be. And same with the Underlanger. I mean, he's been just with us since 2004, I think. He came over into the IPS and he's still there. So a lot of those people who keep that institutional knowledge, build up those skills, and love every day of what they're doing. But like I said, we had a lot of other people joining who didn't have that love. And then you start to have to manage their problems and their issues. And I said, I don't look forward to going to work, where I used to be happy to get to work at 6 in the morning if I woke up early, because get there, start doing some work. And I just felt, I cannot wait 17 more years till I retire. I'll just be miserable for 17 years. And then I'll spend the first 10 years of my retirement bitching and moaning about, the police, this, that, and the other. And I don't want to do that to myself. It's not worth anything to do that.
I'm not a great manager myself, and I enjoy what I do, which
Yeah.
is I like getting up in the morning and coming to work. Yeah,
And I mean, I was a case guy. I love being on crime scenes. I love testifying. I love interviewing suspects. I like doing the job. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, you said about serial murderers. So you said they spend a lot more time not murdering than murdering. You also say normal people can do incredibly violent things.
You know, we always imagine serial murderers are these horrible people. They're doing bad things all the time, including murders. But the reality is, they're kind of living very normal lives. They're typically not in a criminal lifestyle, like robbing, stealing, cheating, cash and transit robberies, etc. You know, they go to their work, they do their job, they have relationships, they have kids in some cases, but they have this urge that pops up every now and then to go out and find a victim and satisfy that urge by usually raping and killing them. But even if you take someone like the Quarry serial murderer mentioned in the book, who killed 16 people, let's say you spent an hour doing that, or even 2 hours, times 16, it's not even a work week if you cram it all together. So the other time they're going to the toilet, they've got toothache, they have to make food, they've got to put money on the table, they're happy, they're sad, etc. So they're more like us than not. And maybe I think that's what is scary about it for people, is that it could literally be your neighbor. All of these people were somebody's neighbor, and
Absolutely.
they had no idea what they're up to.
Absolutely. Why did you choose the cases that you discussed in this particular book? I hear that you're going to do another one.
I am. So the cases, I think they all were very interesting for me for various reasons. Like, you know, one or two where we were literally in charge of the investigation, which doesn't always happen as profilers. We often just join the investigation to assist.
Yeah.
And other two were just fascinating cases. The first one in the book is my first crime scene I ever went to, so I didn't know what I was doing. And how that actually was a serial murderer who was caught after the first one due to very good work by the investigating officer, Pine Pinard. The Quarry case, I was in charge of the task team. I didn't ask for it. One day we were pushing for a task team to be started, and eventually the divisional commissioner said, "Here's your task team, you're in charge of it." And I thought, oh, okay, I wasn't quite asking for that.
For that specifically.
So they all kind of are interesting for me personally for different reasons. And also, you know, it's one thing to talk about a case like on a podcast or give training to detectives. But when you put into a book, you have to be very specific. You can't just say, "And then we did this." Like, when did you do that? You know, the editor's like, "But when?" You've got to give me a date. And you can't just say the detective. You've got to say, what was his name?
It
So
just
I had to
doesn't
make
happen.
sure I had enough info. So it was great cases that I thought were phenomenal and interesting. And also that I had enough documentary, copies of the files that I could make sure I got it as accurate as possible. So there's more cases that are coming, more even, as I said, more that are even sometimes maybe more interesting in these cases, and those will be in book
In the
2.
new book. When do you think you still have to write it?
Well, I literally signed the contract with Penguin yesterday. That for the past month they've been sending me emails. "Don't you want to think about it? Take your time, think about it." And it was easy when this was written during lockdown 5 and 4. I had nothing to do. I couldn't work. So it was a combination of my mind being in the right space, and literally there was time to do it. And it churned it out in, I think, 2 or 3 months. So now it's different, because now the world's back up and running.
Absolutely.
You kind of have to work and find and scrape and scrounge for money. But they've made a nice, which I'm very fortunate, they've also given me a bit of an advance, which makes it easier to sit down and write. Because normally you only get your royalties a year after they get onto the shelf, the books. So basically they want it by January. The chapters must be ready,
that's actually quite fast.
Then it goes through the various processes of editing and the
and
tweaking.
stuff like that.
So it'll probably be out middle this year, maybe around this time next year.
That's great. I must tell you, if anybody wants to go and read the book, it was a really good read. So
Thank you very much.
as a layman, I've always seen South African serial killers. If I look at it from the outside, and I might be totally wrong, they look a little bit different for me from the normal serial killers that you get overseas, like the ones you get in the States and stuff like that. Is that true?
Yeah, look, I think the biggest differences for me is in how the modus operandi. You know, almost across the board in South Africa, serial murderers, serial rapists, they will approach a victim in the streets. "Are you looking for a job?" "You are." "I've got a job. I pay 300, 500 rand a day. It's a cashier. It's a helper at a house. It's a kitchen staff at a
A
restaurant."
lot of it involved a con like that. That's
exactly.
what I...
And because we have so many desperate people for work, you don't have to look particularly snazzily dressed to be convincing. You could stutter. As long as they think that you could possibly give them a job, they will go with you, whether it's immediately or they'll say, "Come back tomorrow, meet me here, bring your ID book." It sounds even less threatening and worrisome. And because of the desperation of people. But if I tell that to my colleagues, by profiling colleagues in the States, in the Netherlands, they'll say like, nobody in the Netherlands would go with some random dude and then walk through the veld. It's like it wouldn't happen, which is why overseas you might find it's more picking up the prostitute, getting them in your vehicle, driving somewhere. Well, our guys also don't have cars because they're usually doing piece jobs, so they don't have a car. So they have to lure you with a car involuntarily to the point where they're going to rape and murder you and leave the body. Whereas the American serial murder can pick you up in one area, take you to another area, rape and murder, and then dump your body 100 kilometers away.
Absolutely, it's very different, and it looks like ours are a lot more in open veld, not in urban areas, which I think it's more overseas. If I look at like it.
Your stock standard is a naked dead female in the veld. That's your serial murder crime scene, but it's also the crime scene that a lot of initial investigators look at it like, well, I don't even know who this is. There's no clues. I don't have a cell phone I could follow up, and the case doesn't get a lot of attention. So initially, a lot of these cases are really, the basics aren't really even properly done until we realize it's part of a serial through DNA or whatever, and then the task team jumps in and obviously brings it up to standard.
Okay. You also mentioned that your unit was one of the busiest in the world. I don't think a lot of people deal. You said about 110 serial type cases.
Yeah.
I don't think most people do that in the units. How many serial stuff do they do in a 14-year period already here?
Yeah, I mean,
not that many.
So, I mean, I have colleagues who worked. So, some states in the US had their own profiling units. Then, of course, you had the FBI, which could be invited to assist, and etc. So, if you're working, for example, in the Virginia State Police's profiling unit, in your 20-year career, you might have worked on 2 or 3 serial murder series. As I said, I worked on 110 and I just stopped counting. And Yanni and Elmarie have worked on more since I've left. So that's great experience for us because we build up a volume of experience, a lot of expertise, what's work. We banged our heads and made mistakes, and we can help the next detective not bang their heads and make those mistakes. So very, very busy in that regard, just in terms of overall numbers of cases. But also, as the unit developed over the years, we got more busy just from more cops knowing about us. So when I joined in 2001, our case register for the whole unit, for the year, we made maybe 20, we entered 20 cases, investigations that we were working on. So that's like just over 1 a month, 1.2. When I left, we were doing like, opening up in our case register, just at the national unit, 20 to 30, at least 20 to 30 a month.
Because I'm sure in the past it might have been missed. People didn't see the patterns.
We did. I mean, we only really started using DNA, for example, probably really on a fairly consistent, large-scale basis round about the mid-90s, 94, 95. And then it was a very basic form of DNA. But also back in those days, not all DNA was processed. So if you had a rape victim, reported the case to the police, she went to the district surgeon with the detective, they did the swabs, they sent it to forensics. Forensics just opened the kit, tested it to see if there's a biological sample on the swab, and they would stop. And they would say to the detective, we've got a positive sample. When you arrest someone, send in their DNA blood. In those days, it was a blood sample. Then we will process this one to completion to get the DNA code, and we'll process the reference sample of your suspect and see if they work, they compare. The argument was, well, why do we want to process this crime scene example if we don't yet have a suspect to compare it? So we're wasting time, money, resources, which I can kind of understand, but you're also then not picking up serials. And that changed around about 2011, 2012, where the person who took over the forensics division, the General Paslani, who's now facing all the corruption charges.
Yes.
And he actually said, no, we need to process everything because it's like taking a fingerprint from a crime scene, not putting it into APHIS and putting it in your drawer till you find a suspect and then let's check if he matches my crime scene print. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And that caused massive amounts, an explosion of the things we were missing that were now being identified.
But there was also a database 2016 or something, you said there was an APS database, but now we're going a step backwards again because in the news lately, there's the rape kits and stuff is not processed. What's happening with that? I was going to ask about it later, but let's have a chat about that now.
I think it's bad management and people in positions that they perhaps are not already experienced for. And, things like that, you have to make sure that if it takes 6 months to order chemicals, and you've got 6 months supply, you need to have started the process of applying now.
Yeah.
So that's sort of maintenance, there's a nicer word for it, but planning, succession planning in terms of your system to keep it running.
Yeah.
It's like if you are a mechanic and you don't order the things that you need to fix your cars, your car's not going to get fixed, they're going to sit.
Is that what's happening?
I think it's primarily that's what happens. It's not a shortage of people. I think it's more the chemicals needed and keeping things running. And that's a management issue. not per se the individuals on the ground issue. So when I started in the police, 6 weeks was the average waiting time for DNA, which internationally actually was very good. And then it jumped up to 6 months. So I'm not too sure what, or now it's not working at all. Whereas but I must also say, my colleagues in the States used to, on average, wait for 6 months. For a little police department to get their DNA results back, would wait for 6 months. So we did definitely have things quite well. But then you also get the UK, which like 24 hours, you got your DNA. And it only takes 8 hours to process DNA, but it's going through all the steps and the backlog of other cases that are there before you.
Absolutely. So do you think in South Africa there's a propensity for for serials, because there's a lot of them. If you have a look at a place like Attershaw, I think there was a good couple just in that small area.
There's certain towns. Pretoria's had its whole fair share. Yes. Joburg's had its fair share. So there are definitely towns that have had quite a number. Do we have more?
Poverty related a lot, or
I think poverty. I think we are in general a violent society, and I think the more violent your society is, and the more normal murders you have, the more likely you're going to have lots of serial murderers.
There must be a cultural. I studied anthropology, cultural anthropology. There is a side of that makes you a certain kind of person and how you deal with other people, and obviously that has an influence on it.
Yeah, so we ultimately don't know what causes person A to become a serial, but I do think that if you're growing up in impoverished environments, no proper role models, it's easier for that serial murder underlying desire to come out if you're in a context where you're not exposed to care and love and support and being able to get yourself further in life. But again, as we always say, having said that, we've had serial murderers that grew up in a family with both parents, had a stable job at the time, had a wife, had a child, and also. So I do think the bad circumstances are not helpful to someone who has that underlying serial murder nation.
But it's not the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
Okay. Muti murders in South Africa, there's nothing of that in your book, but I'm sure there must be, because that's quite a big thing in South Africa. Is that necessarily a South African thing, or is Muti murders elsewhere as well?
So obviously Muti murder, using human body parts for traditional potions and taken from a live victim who usually dies. So, when I presented at a conference overseas on this topic, I had people from Asia saying, historically we used to have something very, very similar to what you're describing, where people would be killed, body parts used, etc. And then I think someone from South America sort of popped up and said, historically we also used to have that. So I think at some point in most countries' histories or regions, continents' history, there was something of this nature involving human body parts. It's occurring throughout Africa. It's not limited to South Africa.
No, absolutely.
And I did definitely work on quite a number of cases. None in this book. Maybe book 2 I'll have a Muti case. And it is unique. I think if my colleagues overseas were to come onto a crime scene that we know is a Muti case, they would totally misdiagnose it, calling it probably a sexual murder, because typically genitals are involved. And they would go totally on the wrong tangent from a profiling point of view, because they wouldn't know that there's another possibility for why you would see something like this, because they would typically more see it maybe in a serial murder scenario. So that's interesting how they're fascinating cases. We also originally had the occult crimes unit in the old days in SAPS that did a lot of input on those cases. We started to get involved in them from the point of view of discriminating when is it a serial versus a potential Muti case. So we would often end up co-consulting on
There was a cult thing quite close by on Weskoppies, just around the corner. I don't know if a while ago, somebody, I can't remember the specific cases, but it was young kids, and the girl actually killed somebody else and stuff. So the cult murders, I think, is also, it's a worldwide thing, and it's here as well. So. You also talked about that mostly overseas the profilers are civilians. Here are all SAPS members, am I correct? They all have police background? Or
So everybody who works in the investigative psychology unit gets in, they're either existing members of the service who come into the unit through promotion or transfer, or if they join us from outside, they then are employed in terms of the Police Act. So yes, if you look at, for example, the UK's profile unit, the serious crime analysis section, they're all civilians. In the Netherlands, it's at their profile unit was a mixture of civilian and police appointees. If you were a detective, you would usually have the police background. If you're a psychologist, you would be employed as a civilian. So that was quite unique that all of our people were SAPS members. So we didn't have any kind of legal barriers about us. So my colleagues in the UK who do this wouldn't be allowed to participate in the interviewing of a suspect. They wouldn't be allowed to go to the crime scene. They wouldn't be allowed to do the autopsy, which we had obviously arranged to do all of that. So that was quite nice and unique, and I think helpful, because yes, there are some times where you need to tell a detective, give an order to a detective. Now, we never like to kind of get involved in a case and feel like we're bossing people around, but worst case scenario, we could say, you're going to do this because I'm a brigadier and you're a constable and I need you to do it. Or in request from his management or provincial management that case be allocated to different people. So yes, and interestingly enough, most profilers in the world are not actually psychologists. The majority of profilers are actually people with an investigation background. So the FBI, none of their profilers are psychologists.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
So that's again quite unique about us in SAPS. They might have a psychologist working in the unit, but they are not themselves. They won't be trained as a profiler.
Okay, that is really interesting. Okay, both of us are firearm owners. So I've recently interviewed Ricky Mann, another
from the
club member, and we talked about, especially we looked at the WITS report and a couple of other reports, and firearms plays a minuscule role in murder, the murder rate in South Africa. In terms of that, you did mention some stuff in your book. Do firearms play a big role in murder serials and murder rapists?
Almost never. If I can literally probably count on one hand the number of, out of the 200 plus serial murderers we've had in South Africa, the ones that have used firearms, it's literally probably about 5 or 6. So Cobus Heldenes, the Norwood guy who was a policeman.
Again, the Norwood policeman again. I said Norwood
his service pistol.
Yeah. So that was also not a privately owned firearm.
The saloon killer which was before my time in the police, was in Piet Retief. He got hold of a .22 rifle, I think, and was then shooting people. The Wemapan, Cedric Marker, the Wemapan serial murderer, used other weapons until he came across the victim with a firearm, and then used that. But it's literally, I think, 4 or 5 serial murderers like the hands-on personal method, and shooting someone isn't very personal.
No, it's not.
But strangling them is, stabbing them is.
You think that gives them satisfaction?
It's about power, power control, venting that anger, etc. So without a doubt, it's definitely, firearms are not a feature in serial murders, no.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Okay, you say to become a state patient, the person must lack criminal responsibility for their crimes. Maybe you can specifically talk about the Brighton Beach murders, because the guy obviously had a lot of psychological issues, and he was found to be fit to stand trial. Okay.
So in that case, which again is there's more detail in the book about it. So he was a Pundile Nchongwana who was arrested within about 2 weeks. But in sort of the 8 days of his actual murder series, I think it was 4 people, I remember correctly, that he killed and decapitated quite a few of them. So when he was arrested,
very violent with the axe,
and literally on the street would be decapitating, and people would be driving past like, what on earth's going on there? So very, very violent. The Blue Bulls team fans always hate it when I say this, but he was actually one of the first black players to play for the Blue Bulls rugby team.
And apparently, I did mention it a bit later, but he was apparently really large.
He was a big boy. He was a big man.
You couldn't even put, when they got arrested him, they couldn't put on normal handcuffs. And you also said, you were looking for a way out just in case when you were with him in the room, because he was quite intimidating.
So, after he was arrested, myself and Colonel DeLonge went down to interview him, and in the room was Lieutenant Colonel Jason McGray from Brighton Beach Detectives, and I think the suspect and his lawyer, this poor guy who was literally the last minute phone to come and sit and be present. But Pundile was huge. I mean, I think he must have been a forward, a big guy. And he had this way of staring at you with his eyes when you asked a question he didn't like. So as I say in the book, I was sitting there thinking, I can definitely outrun Yanni. So if something goes wrong, I'm not going to be the guy who's going to be grabbed, because Yanni's slower than me.
It's the normal predator thing. Don't be the slowest one.
Exactly. So he's the only guy ever, when I was interviewing, thought, I didn't feel really scared, but I thought, if things go pear-shaped,
how are you going to deal with it?
Beat the crap out of you within a few seconds. So if he gets his hands around your neck, it's tickets for you. So he was interesting, but he had a history of schizophrenia for, I think, 2 or 3 years before the murders.
He's been in and out of hospitals, I think in Valkenburg, he was in the Cape and Natal as well.
So that was not disputed, and we didn't have an issue with that. The issue, of course, was that and he was sent for observation at Fort Napier, which is where the equivalent of Sterkfontein up here in Gauteng, or Weskoppies in Pretoria. For that court-ordered 30-day observation to see the time of the crime, were you in control of your behavior? And if not, was it because of mental illness issues? And of course, now that we have to put you on trial, are you able to consult with your lawyer, or not, and is it because of mental health issues? And that's what they're really looking at in that observation, the then and there of the incident or incidents, and right now that we need to put you on trial. Because you can have someone who's completely sane when they committed a murder. They were angry, found their wife in bed with a neighbor, killed them both. But maybe 6 months or a year later when it's going on to trial, he has genuinely developed mental health issues. You can't put that person on trial. He can't advise his lawyer. It is unfair to put that person on trial. The difference is that guy who was sane at the time of the crime, but mentally ill now, will be made a state patient, but once he's healthy, he's going to go back on trial because he still has to account for what he did back then. If it's the other way around, that at the time of your crime, say the voices are telling you to stab this person and you go and stab them, well, that's something you can't undo. That's back then and there. And the court might find you not responsible due to mental illness, and you'll also become a state patient, but then your trial will never continue. And you'll be kept in the hospital until they feel you're safe to be released into society, which could be longer than your sentence would have been, but it can also be shorter.
So you also say that some people would try and say that they've been insane at the time of things, but they're not.
So it's difficult to fake it, and when you're sitting in front of someone doing one of these observations, which is what I did when I worked at Weskoppies quite often, they'd come up with these really, you had to really stop yourself not to laugh the way they were trying to pretend that they are mentally ill, because it's just not how it actually appears.
Yes, okay. What is your youngest offender that you had to deal with, and what is the oldest?
I know definitely the youngest serial murderer that I dealt with was 16 when he committed his first murder. He then was court diverted, and then when he came out on leave from his little court diversion for the December holidays, raped and killed another woman. So 16 when he started. There have definitely been people who've been 14 years old that have killed parents and done stuff like that. Don Steenkamp, of course, from the Griquas family murders. I think he was 16 at the time.
He wasn't.
Young. So that kind of, just in my involvement, although there have been youngers that I wasn't personally involved in those cases.
Okay. Oldest? Do they start old, or most of them were in the 30s, 40s?
Yeah, your average serial murderer, and again, we've had older, we've had younger, the average age for serial murderers when they commit their first murder is 29. So it's actually a bit older than we're aware of. I mean, the cases we don't know about that the guy had committed. But the average from our research was about 29 years old when they start their first murder. The oldest serial murder was probably that we've caught was probably in his late 40s, Jack Mokhale from Ranford.
So it's not a very large difference in terms of the time.
And the longest time span we've ever had from first to last murder was 21 years.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
And how many cases?
3 that we know of.
Okay, but you think it's probably more?
There could very likely be more. It's very arrogant to say, we've got him for all of them. Specifically because that first one was 87, and then 21 years, what's that? So basically 2007, 8 was the last one. A lot could have happened that we just don't know about. And that was Northern Cape, which is a big place.
It is a big place. You're talking a lot in the book about case linkages, and how's this important, and how does it link to comfort zones and stuff like that for serials? Yeah,
so obviously when we're in an investigation, our biggest thing is which cases could be the work of this guy and which might not be. You don't want to include unnecessary ones because that can skew your process of investigation. So, I think from early days, any investigation, trying to figure out who could be the same person, you look at modus operandi, what they've done, how they've done it, the victimology, to try and say these ones could be, specifically in the absence of forensic evidence like DNA or ballistics linkages, etc., as examples. So what we noticed, and which was also documented overseas, is that your serials tend to like geographical comfort zones. So they have a particular area where they like to troll for their victims. It could be a block in the city, it could be a portion of veld, and another comfort zone where they like to take their victims and commit whatever act, rapes, murders, etc. So we have typically 2 comfort zones. So again, if we find a bunch of cases, bodies being found in this generalized area, so that's a very good warning sign. You probably have a serial because of that reusing of that same area. Similarly, the places where they find the victims. But we didn't just use that from an investigation point of view to decide which cases could be part of the series, or do we have a series, etc. We started to present that in evidence in court, where we charge a guy for a bunch of cases, like the Quarry serial murder cases.
So there was bodies lying around there. It was quite
so
bizarre.
We had 16 murders eventually before we caught him. And
it was it sounded like you were falling over bodies.
Exactly. But only 8 of them did we have either the cell phone that we recovered, DNA, or he confessed or pointed out that scene to the investigating officer, or to an officer. So the other 8, we knew it was him because victimology, how the victims died, the conditions that they were left in, geographical spacing where those bodies were found. And we then did what we did in the investigation phase, but in the courtroom now, saying, in our opinion, with our experience on these cases, that all cases are the work of the same individual. I can't say it's who's charged, but I can just say whoever did this, it's the same individual.
Same person, okay. You said that a person cannot rehabilitate a serial murderer. Why do you say that?
I think partly because we don't
So
really...
there's a lot of people that, that think, there's sunshine and roses everywhere, and that, everybody...
People will change. If you find God, you will change and won't become a serial murderer again.
Because there's a lot of people that find God in jail, and then they come out...
Well, there's a lot of priests, dominis and pastors in jail. Okay. So that's the other side of the coin,
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not to bash religion, but I think we must be very careful that, religion is a very easy thing for any criminal to say in prison, oh, I've found God, and convince that pastor or priest to get on their side and support them. This guy's changed, he's rehabilitated. But nowhere have I ever seen that religious affiliation is a risk-reducing factor. Like I said, we've had lots of Catholic priests as one very good example of people who were actively involved in church life but were molesting people. So that itself isn't going to stop you, specifically if it's not a genuine belief. So we don't know what makes someone a serial murderer. So do we know how to fix them? And they are typically very well behaved in prison because they're not living this criminal lifestyle, like I said. So they're kind of normal, and if they don't have access to the victims, of course they're going to be normal, So that's not a good predictor of what they're going to be like when they're back in society. Faced by the same stresses, challenges.
And the same things that sets them off.
Exactly.
So I'm sure there must be certain things that set them off.
Yeah. And so we always say you're giving him a second chance at life, but a victim a first chance at death. And that's just, I don't think we can play with that game.
No, you can't. You talked about the pointing out process, that it can't always be used, but that used as a first line of sort of conviction, if you want to put it, but that it can actually help you with actually putting things in place.
And I've never really encountered another law enforcement agency that does it the way we do it, that it can be used nicely as evidence in court.
Okay. Basically, it is, maybe explain to the viewers what it is. It is exactly what it is. It says, but maybe just explain a little bit more in detail about what it...
So what we developed in our legal system, it's pointing out in Afrikaans uitwysing.
Yeah.
So let's say you arrest a suspect for whatever crime, doesn't matter what the crime is. We'll just stick with the series for our purposes now.
Yeah.
And during the interviewing, the person says, I'll do a confession, and we say, well, are you prepared to point out the various locations of what you've done to an independent officer? Now again, officer meaning someone with a officer rank, a lieutenant, captain or higher, who had no involvement in the case, no knowledge of the case, he's not part of the task team, hadn't been to the crime scenes. And if that person says yes, I'm prepared to do that, you then phone whoever you know does these types of things and say, I've got to point it out. You don't tell him anything about the case, you're not allowed to, and say, can you be in my office at 2 o'clock today? And that person then arranges a crime scene photographer who also has no involvement in the case. He comes to the officers, you hand that suspect over to them, and you leave that suspect with that officer. He then asks them a whole bunch of standard questions, like the same thing if you're doing a confession. There's like a 20-page document. Were you threatened? Were you promised anything? Do you have any injuries? Would you like to make a complaint against any police officer? All these things you go through. And at the end of that, if he still wants to go ahead, the officer says, well, I don't know anything about this case, but I believe you want to show me some things. What is it? And then you literally get into the car. He would take you somewhere, and he would stop here, and he would say, this is where I killed the lady, or this is where I met the lady. And then the photographer, the crime scene thing, that's why it's a pointing out, and the officer would be writing down everything he says.
And that helps with the conviction.
Yeah. So he's not out to interrogate him, but he has to write down whatever he says. And sometimes we've even found bodies that we hadn't found in that process.
Yeah.
So it's insider knowledge that only the suspect would have, which is fantastic evidence then to present in court.
And you have to obviously build up a rapport with when you interview serial murderers. And you always say, treat them with respect, I suppose. It doesn't help to be aggressive, and because you're just not going to get what you want.
It's not your chance to vent your frustration and anger. And there's some interesting research that shows that the majority of people are actually prepared to confess, at least to something, if you don't screw it up. Yes. If you're an ass to someone, they're just going to, well, I'm not going to give you the credit of me telling you what I did. So if you interview them correctly, it doesn't mean I like these people, I don't approve of what they've done, but I've got a different goal, and that's to get them to talk. So being respectful, treating them decently, because they're expecting to be treated badly. And almost have an inquiring mind. And through our training, which we give to detectives, you also understand a bit more likely why he was doing certain things. And it's very often the first time they get to talk to anybody.
And actually put it out maybe in words.
To someone who has an idea of what they were experiencing. Whereas, your cash and transit robbers, everybody knows who the cash and transit kingpins are and the hijackers in the community. And they can even sit in the shebeen and brag about it. But these guys can't talk to anybody. Their friends, the closest, their partners, etc., business colleagues, because you don't talk about serial murder to people. So it's often the first time they can talk to someone, and if you show that insight and opportunity for them to hear what they have to say without judging them, that is very often what then causes them to say, yes, I'm prepared to do a formal confession, or ideally that pointing out.
Which they sometimes do, and then they recant it when...
Almost always they decide, nope, I'm not going to plead guilty, because just because you did a confession doesn't mean, almost rarely does it mean you're going to end, or in practicality, do you actually end up pleading guilty?
Yeah, and you also say that there's a lot more work after the person has been arrested before.
I mean, people think that you've caught him, done and dusted, and that's it. No, there's a massive amount of work getting that case ready for trial, making sure your evidence is there, chain of custody. And because people do, as I said, don't ultimately plead guilty, even though they've confessed, and you have to leave that evidence in court, etc. So a massive amount of work after you've actually caught your suspect.
It was also, do you think at station level people are reporting stuff significantly? I looked at the Wits report again in terms of the what they do when they have a murder or whatever. They talk about, they don't say what weapon was used, they don't go into detail and stuff. Yesterday I met with a lady that started the GBV Monitor project, and the main thing is the reporting is not good.
Yeah.
It doesn't say exactly what weapon is used, how did the suspect look, all of those type of things. So I think that if you don't, you did mention in some of the cases that you had people that just the dockets were like nearly empty. So I'm sure that must be a problem.
I mean, we had, the old stats was the 1 in 9 people, victims of a sexual offence, would report to the police. And I think the stats have changed, and they're probably already even outdated. It was 1 in 20 people come forward to report.
And you basically say, so for every one person, there's 9 people that don't report. It's crazy.
And the less we have faith in the police, the less people will report any kind of crime. If you think they don't care and they're not going to solve it, I'm not going to report it. So dropping in crime stats doesn't mean that there's a drop in crime.
No.
It's actually just might be the people that have no faith that they're going to be treated properly and decently by the police, or that they'll solve it. Therefore, I'm not going to go report it. And I mean, without a doubt, we used to look at the initial statements taken of rape victims, of witnesses to crime, or other victims of crime. It's shocking. And I get it. People often write in their second language, so that is difficult. I mean, I speak Afrikaans fluently, but I don't want to put pen to paper and send an email in Afrikaans. But the statements are just such poor quality that you literally can't even figure out what actually happened. If you have to play it out in your mind, you can't actually understand how this event took place. And that's a real big problem.
A lot of your victims you didn't actually, you couldn't identify. Yeah. Isn't that a really sad thing, that nobody's missed this person? This person was killed, and nobody misses them. Is it because of a lot of foreigners being in South Africa, do you think, or
I
just
think
the makeup of South African society? Why do you think? Yeah.
So if you look at the Quarry case, we had 16 bodies. I think 5, off the top of my head, were actually identified. So it can be things from the body is very decomposed. We can't recover the fingerprints. Yes, you can take DNA, but you don't have a DNA database of everybody in the country.
Yeah.
So I think it's partly that, the forensic circumstances, but we had a lot of fresh bodies where we couldn't. And you run them through the Home Affairs database, and they don't pop up as anything. So very likely that it could be people who are in the country legally or illegally, but they're not on a fingerprint database. And, where do you report? If your family member used to live here, but they've been living in Gauteng now, you don't know where they went missing. So which police station are you reporting it to?
Also, we've got such a lot of transient people that come from the rural areas to work in the cities, etc. It's problematic.
So it was always sad that we get convictions. I mean, the Quarry case, we got convictions on all 16 murders, but a whole bunch of people out there don't know where their mother, daughter, auntie,
is dead.
Is dead. Whatever happened to them? And I think that's incredibly sad.
That is very sad. The Muldersdrift rapist was actually arrested in the toilet, and that was actually a very a humorous story in the end, because he was having a discussion with one of the other officers female profilers. Well,
Yeah.
So in the end, what happened? So he was talking, and you actually got his phone, and it was in one of these
Porta toilets.
porta toilets.
Yeah, so I mean, long story short, he was raped a number of women in the Muldersdrift area near the Lion Park, and there's now a sort of an adventure park with sort of footy slide types of things there, just off the 512 and the N14, and raped a number of women over a sort of a two-year period, and so yeah, when we eventually were able to identify him through the cell phone number that he contacted the victims, and before we arrested him, we were already, one of our female members in the unit, Suzette Knutzer, was chatting with him, and he started flirting with her and kind of wanted to set up a bit of a date. And we used that to our advantage. Ultimately, we were going to set up a date and grab him there if we couldn't track him through other means. And eventually, when we did track him, it was in Kaya Sands, which is now, drove past there the other day, it's completely built up. But by then, it was basically a shantytown environment. And we literally traced into a little portable toilet on the border of that particular informal settlement. And he was literally masturbating while he was
talking
chatting
to
Suzette. So we pulled him out there and,
That must have been that was quite a humorous story for me. The Muldersdrift rapist also raped a 7-year-old, and this is one of the reasons he got a life sentence. How prevalent is serial raping of minors? There was another story, I think, in the news yesterday about it, which is really horrific.
You know, we definitely have had a series of rapes against children. More frequently, sort of 12, 13, maybe 10 is kind of like Fanuel Kamalo, the celebrity chef many years ago, who was literally picking up young girls and raping them out around Joburg. So, but the younger you get, it's less frequent, thank goodness. So the 7-year-old is definitely amongst the younger age of victims that we see. I think it's also, again, happening a lot more, but not being reported to authorities. And thankfully, that little girl's aunt and them did report that immediately to the police. So years later, when we caught this guy, and there was DNA, the DNA people said, hey, we've matched this to an old case. And because she was different to the victimology of all of other victims, we weren't even looking at little kids.
And that's where the DNA came in. And what was interesting is because she was 7 years old, that automatically goes into a sentence, life sentence, am I correct?
Yeah, so again, because with adults, you can have a defense of consent, which could get you off. You say, no, but we had voluntary sex, and now she just is unhappy and opened up a case. But the good thing, I say that with inverted commas, about child rape, you can never have a legal consent to have sex with a child.
Absolutely not.
Even if they volunteer, that's not, so that's, again, it's automatic conviction, the mere presence of the DNA. That's probably one of the few cases where it's literally, you can say, an automatic conviction. And because they're under 18, it's going to be life sentence starting point.
I know our time is starting to run things, but I want to just cover general trends throughout your book, because when Celebi closed your specialised centres in 2006. What impact did this have, and what is the situation like now? And Cele recently, on 2 occasions in the last year, said that they cannot fulfill their mandate.
Yeah.
How do you think this is going to have an influence on your specialised cases?
It's had a massive influence. So Jackie Celebi, who was then the National Commissioner, we all know he was later convicted for corrupt activities. In 2006, literally about a week or two after we arrested the Quarry serial murderer, he made a blanket statement that all SPES units, serious and violent crime units, which was the later versions of the murder and robbery units, the sexual offences units, drug units, you name it, and all task teams. Now, often a provincial commissioner or area commissioner might put together a task team for a specific crime. All of them just across the board had to shut down, like that. So, some of our members from our task team were sent to the stations. Luckily, we had at least caught our guy. We were able to keep one member on board to help finish up the investigation. But we saw a mass exodus of the ex-serious and violent crime detectives into the private sector where they were getting paid 3-4 times their salary, because now they get stuck in the station where literally a lot of them were being tasked to investigate almost arbitrary crimes like cell phone thefts, things that is a total misapplication of their skills and knowledge.
Absolutely.
They often were treated badly, ironically, by the stations, because they had this attitude, you guys think you're all, the bee's knees, so I'll show you. And the idea of logic that Celebi was using, well, if these guys are so great, we must sprinkle them amongst each station. But they were great because they worked as a team.
They worked together.
10 guys on a standby group went out, one guy had the docket responsibility, but those other 9 are helping him follow things up, etc.
You basically said that it's got to be a task team.
Absolutely.
That's what made you so successful.
So we lost a lot of capacity as a result of that. People just left. People became demoralized. And yes, we've reopened up the sexual offences unit in the family violence, child protection, sexual offences units as one. They haven't really ever replaced something for the serious and violent crime units. So some provinces, the organised crime unit might deal with some violent crime, but not your sort of good old-fashioned Oscar Pistorius type of murders. There's nobody whose sole responsibility is. So you'll get at a station 1 or 2 detectives who will deal with all unnatural deaths. Okay. So a car accident, a suicide, murder, death under medical treatment.
Are so different.
And then there's one detective who's got 30, 40 dockets of this very high caliber, serious nature. We can't expect great success from someone under that workload.
That is quite sad. If somebody wants to do a career in profiling in South Africa, how do they go about it?
It's a common question. It is very limited, unfortunately. So, the police are only going to use the investigative psychology section. They don't use anybody privately, locally or internationally to assist them on that capacity with cases. So people who are interested would ultimately have to end up joining the unit. Now, we have detectives who end up joining, getting a position in our unit. They might not necessarily be trained as profilers, but they'll get involved in these types of cases, and they become major case management experts, as I like to call it, which is also what the FBI does. The other option is you can become typically a clinical psychologist and then apply for a post in our unit where you'd get involved in these cases. Then you could get training as a profiler. They've also, in the recent years, started to employ criminologists and researchers. So potentially any one of those various professions, if you show the aptitude and potential, could probably end up becoming what we would regard as a profiler. But that's kind of it, unfortunately. There's no university course in South Africa that you can go study. Even if you study criminology, psychology, that doesn't make you a profiler. It's a whole bunch of investigation background and experience and knowledge that you have to have, which is why typically overseas your profilers are actually typically murder detectives or sexual offences detectives who then got into the field of profiling, which is a great basis for that type of knowledge to have.
Okay. You're no longer with SAPS. What are you doing right now? What business do you do?
So, as I said, left 2016 March after 14.5 years. So I opened up a company, LNS Threat Management, which primarily helps corporates when there are threats towards their staff. So your workplace violence type of stuff. So in America, it's like the mass shootings. Yeah. How do we prevent that? Of course, we don't have lots of mass shootings here. Well, there was one not too recently, about a week or two ago in KZN. So we kind of focus on anonymous threats to the CEO or staff, customers who are unhappy, and then make threatening emails, etc.
There's a big case that I know here somewhere with the estate agents that there was a specific case, if I remember.
So whether it's in-house, we find a lot of staff threatening or concerning behavior. So basically what we'll do is we'll step in, do an analysis of the situation, advise them how concerned they should be, but more importantly, how they're going to make sure that violence doesn't take place. So it's far more preventative if you're reacting early when there's concerning behavior. Step in, assess it, evaluate it, mitigate it. Then you can actually prevent the violence, hopefully, from taking place.
Okay, so last one, and I did mention that earlier in the office, and it was surprised that other people have watched this. I usually like to go and read up a little bit extra when I read a book. I was reading up about Muti, which I've never heard of before. And suddenly there's these YouTube channels where people start putting on makeup while they're talking about serial killers.
It's a thing.
What do you say about
that's
this?
the first time. I mean, I've noticed that there's an explosion of local YouTube channels where people just obviously do some basic research online and talk about the case. And this one young lady, Tsecho was her name, and she's got 26,000 subscribers. And all she does, she sits at the foot of her bed. I think she must be 18, 19, and she talks about cases that she's researched. There's no fancy graphics or interviewing people. 26,000 subscribers. So there's a massive interest in it. So the one you're referring to, which you told me, is a woman who's basically every show is her putting on makeup while talking about these cases.
It's just
so I think there's a phenomenal interest, which is nice in our local stuff.
Yeah.
And a great appetite, which I think why the book is doing quite well. And we're busy with a lot of documentary series now on local cases, because I think people have realized you don't always have to watch the Jeffrey Dahmer stuff that's overseas. We've got really amazing, interesting cases here. and very good productions that are coming out on these cases. Documentary series that are locally available. Devil's Dorp is another good example, which has got a lot of people talking, and I haven't watched it myself. I was a little bit involved in the case.
I saw Devil's Dorp. I haven't also had time to watch it myself.
So it's nice to see that people are taking an interest in local stuff.
Yes, it is very interesting. It was just absolutely bizarre. I didn't expect somebody to start putting on makeup while talking about a serial murderer. Anyway, thank you very much, and good luck with your new book. I can't wait for it. Anybody that's interested, I know I saw your book at Estrel. Whereabouts that's available online?
Yeah, it's Loot, Take a Lot, exclusive books. It's probably cheaper online, but I don't know if you have to pay the postage. So, but yeah, shop around. But exclusive books definitely will have it, and a lot of independent bookstores. And I think it's great to support the independent bookstores, because selling books in South Africa is a difficult task, and writers definitely don't make a lot of money out of books, despite what you see paying 200 and whatever rand for the book. The writer gets a little part of that. So support local bookshops and of course local writers.
Yeah, I've just done a children's book myself, and I went and bought somebody a children's book, and I was absolutely horrified by the price of the books. Like also for a small little book, $200. So I'm sure people don't make money out of books, but this is more passion and to get part of your history down.
I think so, yeah.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And have a good afternoon. And as I said, I can't wait for your new book.
See you on the range.
Yeah, I'll see you on the range on Saturday.
Absolutely.
Cheers.
Okay, thank you.